The conversation of your life, local, relevant, digital, and always on.
America will hear my 2 cents.
Elected to serve iHub radio listeners across the desert cities. He calls it as he sees it.
Quick question.
Now, here's Russ Betts.
Someone answer him now!
All right, and welcome to another edition of the Russ Betts Show here on, we're at iHub Studios in beautiful downtown Palm Springs. Joining us for the next 2 hours is, I'm going to still call you Council Member Joe McKee. Joe, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Russ.
I noticed they're changing the big marquee out in the front of the building as we come in, where it says the Russ Betts Show that's plastered there. They're going to call it the Russ and Joe Show. I saw them getting out there ready to make the
That's
change.
not necessary, Russ. I'm just here so you can take a breath.
Okay. Yeah, you know what? It is tough to talk for 2 hours. I sure appreciate you having you here.
Not a problem.
You only got, what do they say, 2-3 seconds of dead air time, and so you're here for 2 hours and you can't even come up for air sometimes. You just got to keep going. Otherwise, people, 2 or 3 seconds, their attention span, I guess. Maybe, I don't know. Anyhow, we got a long list of stuff to talk about. You and I were going over it as we were prepping for the show. It should be interesting. I think the news out of Desert Hot Springs with Mission Springs Water District is come up on my radar. They're now finally changing out some water meters. The water meters haven't worked for, I'm going to say, probably 3 years. It'd be my best guess. And that would be confirmed by one of the techs I talked to last week.
Now you got him in trouble.
Well, they don't know who I talked to. So, yeah, I guess I better be careful. But, yeah, what's got him in, what the trouble part would be the line out of Mission Springs Water District, the official line out of Mission Springs Water District, is it's been less than a year that the meters had started failing, which just simply isn't true. It's 50 to 60% of the meters in the district are not working. Well, now they've finally gone around after having these things failed for so long, and they were doing estimated bills.
Yes.
And the estimated bills, they said, well, that's okay. That's an industry standard. It's industry best practice. And I've talked to other people in other water districts, and I said, they've had water meters that haven't worked for 2 or 3 years. And they said, well, that's unbelievable. I said, well, the district says it's 1 year, and they've been doing estimated bills for 1 year. Nobody at any of these water districts I've talked to has said even estimated bills for a year is acceptable on 50 to 60% of the system. So,
no.
Anyhow, what's going on now is they're switching out these meters, and all of a sudden people are getting bills that have jumped up real high. And my neighbor comes up and says, oh, my God, have you seen what your bill looked like? So ours went from 30 to 65, something like that, more than doubled. Mm-hmm. And of course, with my wife, that's like, holy cow.
Oh, you're in water rationing now.
Yeah. And then my neighbor comes up and says, what happened to my water bill? It went from 20 to 120.
Yeah.
And then another guy went from 30 to 160. So I go and I post this just innocently. I post it on social media. Wow, what's going on? Just asking the question. All of a sudden, it turned into this big, long barrage of people sitting there saying, hey, I just got my bill. And the one that took the cake, was a guy who had a $120 normal regular water bill, and he got a bill that was over $500.
Well, the interesting thing about that is, are they going to refund money to the people that are using less water?
I don't know. Well, so you have these people on these estimated meters.
Well, and see, that's the problem. If you're in a position that you charge people to make up, which is part of what's going on here, I think it would be very difficult for someone that was using $22 worth of water, even 3 years ago, to be in a position that they're using $120 worth now. There's either got to be a problem someplace, or they're making up for the fact that they're using more water than they were charging them for.
Yeah, well, and then, you had the situation when somebody has a non-working meter, and this is what got me. Somebody has a non-working meter, and they're getting this bill of, say, $50 a month, and all of a sudden it spikes to $300. Mm-hmm. And the water district was saying, well, you must have a water leak somewhere.
Yeah.
And then the next month, without any repair being made, the bill goes back down to what it was always.
Yeah.
And what gets me is that the water district was telling them, well, look, the meters don't lie. you've got to have a leak somewhere. And somebody says, really? I can't find anything leaking. And at the same time they were telling all those people that stuff, they knew the meter wasn't working. So, yeah, you're right. The meter doesn't lie. It wasn't working at all. So, anyhow, we don't, that all got exposed when people around town discovered what was going on. And then that forced Mission Springs Water District to put out a letter in May of last year. It says, yes, we do acknowledge that we've got some meters that aren't working. But they took the line that it's only been in the last year.
Well, and that it's only a few meters. It's not that many.
Yeah. So, anyhow,
But if you receive a bill, and one of the things that clued me into the fact that there was a problem, if you have a bill and all of the bill amounts are the same as they were last year, you know that there's a problem. It doesn't take much to figure out, hey, wait a minute. Last year for this month, I was not here.
Yeah.
I was on vacation all that whole time. And I got charged the same amount as I did when I was here the year before, or vice versa. It can be either way around. In that circumstance, there's been some sort of problem.
Yeah, well, there's other situations where somebody who they buy a house, and maybe they are the perfect example of somebody who likes to conserve water.
Absolutely.
Maybe a single mom and her daughter. They moved into a house where the previous owners were probably the biggest water hogs you'd ever imagine. Big family, green lawns, water going on. If you go to Google street maps and look at the picture of the house, you actually see water running down the street from the. So she goes in and she's getting a bill of $400 a month. She goes, how could I possibly have a bill of $400 a month? I mean, what does a family pay, $1,000?
Yeah.
And the water district kept telling her, no, that's just it. That the meter doesn't lie. So when I got onto this, that all these meters weren't working, I told her, I said, go out and look at your meter. And she goes out and she looks at her meter and she says, dang, the thing ain't working. How could they? So then they offered her a refund.
Yeah.
They offered her a $200 one-time refund. And she goes, I think you're into me for about $8,000 more than you should be. And $200 refund isn't going to cut it. How do you charge somebody in a tiered rate system? If somebody has a non-working meter, how do you charge them from tier 1 to tier 2? How do you know they went into tier 2?
They would say because they're using historical data, but you're correct. Let's say you were in a position that you didn't know the meter was bad, and all of a sudden you got a bill that was even twice as much as you were used to. What would be your natural reaction to that? You would be in a position that you would say, okay, we're using too much water. Let's cut back. Everybody watch what you're doing and everything else. And then if the next month, if you would have gotten the same bill, you would have thought, what the heck's going on here? I've told my family to cut back. They're not showering as much as they were.
Well, some of the situations where you cut back, like you said, and then the next month it drops back down. So if they're using a historical, reading, an estimated reading based on prior use, maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, or a year ago, whoever was in that house previously did have a water issue where the bill spiked. And so here it comes along to the same month a year later, and they say, oh, well, we're using estimated, so let's just spike the bill again.
Yeah.
And we don't know exactly what was going on. We don't have all the data, but, I mean, this is what I'm seeing out there. And, I don't jump to these conclusions. I sit there and I go, okay, how many meters aren't working? And I find out it's 50 to 60% of the meters.
And this is in a circumstance where we might want to say, if you look at your bill, you pay what, $12.50, $13 a month for a meter fee.
But it went up to $13.40.
Yeah.
So that's the other question is,
you're paying for a meter that doesn't work.
We're paying for me. Yeah, I've got a meter charge. I want that meter charge back. And then on top of that, you got the city utility user tax on top of that.
Yeah.
So, every time I bring this up online, they have people on Mission Springs Water District assigned to go monitor social media. And all hours of the night, whenever you're posting, they'll get on there and they'll post back. And when they know it's me posting, they'll always remind everybody, well, I just want you to know, because I'm a council member in the city of Desert Hot Springs. And they always put in there, well, remember, part of that bill is the utility user tax that the city is charging you. So it's like, hey, Russ.
It's not just us.
Yeah. And so, of course, the voters voted for that. It wasn't anything that we automatically imposed on them. That's a different situation at the water district. They get to vote on these tax increases, it's not the voters.
Rate increases can be adjusted every year. The only thing that you have to worry about is you can't exceed the maximum amount that has been put forth either by an election or a 218 hearing.
Okay, well, what they're saying is that the other thing they come out and they say is that, well, you know what, we have to cover our costs, and this all covers our cost. And then you start looking and say, okay, well, what about your cost? Where are they? And that's where you really need to dig in and look at a budget. And man, how much work is that? You and I know how much work it is just to keep up with the city budget and everything else going on. Now you're going to go dig into another agency's budget with that kind of detail?
Well, everybody can say you're covering your costs. That means nothing. I mean, how much of an increase have you been getting? You and I both know that on top of the increase for water rates, cutting down on the number of tiers and increasing the amount of money they're getting per gallon, there was a huge sewer charge that was increase that was tacked on, where it was going from $450 to $750 in a 5-year period.
Well, yeah, they had, and every year for the past 5 years, there's been water and sewer rate increases.
Exactly.
And, I don't know. It's,
well, and you and I have talked about this and how, it appears that the inflation rate for regular people is really underestimated because of things like this.
Yeah, well, that's been a huge increase in that cost.
Yes.
Now, the interesting detail and what's blowing all this up is that no doubt there are people out there that had a non-working meter that had a lower than what they were actually using rate. Yeah. And now a meter goes on. And now all of a sudden they're being charged for what they're using. So somebody had an artificially low bill of, say, $35. Now all of a sudden is getting a $150 bill. Yep. And so, what happens? Well, that's going to be a huge windfall of money for the water district.
Well, and you were talking earlier about the fact that they've been getting a D-rated bill by 3%. Too,
yeah, when Mission Springs Water District put out a letter, they said, hi, just to be fair to everybody, if you've got a non-working meter, we're discounting your bill automatically by 3%. All right, so now the new meter goes in. They stop with the 3%, and that's what I talk about when we get back from this break, is, what's that do to the rates? I think all of a sudden got a 3% windfall from 60% of the meters.
But it's still covering their cost.
All right. Well, we'll get into that when we get back. This is Russ Betts on iHub Radio with Joe McKee.
The conversation of your life. Local, relevant, digital, and always on.
America will hear my 2 cents.
Elected to serve iHub radio listeners across the desert cities. He calls it as he sees it.
Quick question.
Now, here's Russ Betts.
Someone answer him now!
All right, put the buttons on. You can hear me. I can hear me. We're back here. We're talking about Mission Springs Water District. It's the Russ Betts Show here in iHub Radio in Palm Springs. And again, joining me, very happy to have him here, is, I'm going to call you Council Member Joe McKee. You've been out of that game for a little bit. Joe, let me just take up that question for a little bit. I want to get my head around. They went through a 218, was it 318 or 218? 218 rate increase process. And that was a few years
Which
back.
is one of the differences between what happens to cities and what happens to special districts.
Yeah, so if you use a utility tax, the council doesn't get to just vote on that. It's not something that we just say, hi, there you go, as a city council. You say, hi, voters, we're going to put this in front of you. This is what it's going to pay for. Do you agree?
Yes.
And the majority of the voters vote for that. I think in Desert Hot Springs
in most
case,
cases, it's a supermajority, too.
Yeah, so it was 66 and a third.
Yeah.
So it was a huge number of voters in Desert Hot Springs that voted for that. That was the only way it could have passed.
Yes.
And it got those numbers. So a little disingenuous of the Water District to throw that out every time I get online and ask them legitimate questions. So on this 218 process, they set a baseline of income. And they say, and there's our expenses. We need to meet our expenses. And so we're going to do this. And we're all in keeping with that. And there was a lawsuit by the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association saying that, they were charging too much. And they ended up losing that. The court sided with Mission Springs Water District. But I'm wondering what the outcome of that case would be now if the judge knew that they had 60% of their meters weren't working.
Well, there was another thing that was involved in that. The sewer increase and the water increases both were pretty substantial, but a large portion of the water increase was based on a program that they thought they were going to have to comply with environmentally that they haven't done.
That's the chromium-6 removal.
Right.
And so, they, and you've got one of the directors up there that's making noise saying, hey, guys, you haven't done anything on the chromium-6.
And half of the increase was based on that.
So, the filtering and everything else they'd have to do to get that substance out of the water.
Yes.
And maybe they're deciding it's not as bad as everybody thought it was.
Well, I think rightfully so that everybody that was a water district said, look, this is a naturally occurring issue, and no one knows what the proper amount is that people can handle and it still be safe. The state, being the state of California, set the amount at such a small, an infinitesimal amount that every water district was in a panic at that time.
So some cooler heads prevailed and said, you know what, this isn't as big a deal as somebody thought it was.
Well, no, they're trying to figure out what makes sense. I mean, yeah, I could say, holy cats, this is a problem. The proper amount that you should take in is 0, and put in a circumstance that no one could meet that.
Well, so what you don't know is that they were talking about another increase. They had a rate consultant come in, and he was talking about he determined an early estimate of another 3% a year increase for water and 4% for sewer. And I called the guy and I said, are you aware that this is all based on a rate study where meters aren't working?
Well,
and he didn't even know that.
Well, more than that, I laugh at the sewer thing.
Yeah, well,
we'll talk about that when we get back.
Yeah, we got a little bit more time here on this subject. This is Russ Betts and Joe McKee on the Russ Betts Show here at beautiful downtown Palm Springs, iHub Radio.
Read about it tomorrow. See it tonight. Hear it all day today. If it's happening in the Coachella Valley, it's front and center now on iHub Radio.
And there it is.
Now, here's Russ Betts.
All right, so let's wrap up this MSWD talk. Just a couple things we didn't get to because I wanted to get into you moving to Chicago and ate up our time in the last segment, which was interesting. I think people needed to know that. But I just want to get into how this works now. They were discounting all the meters that weren't working, let's say 60% of them, by 3%.
Yes.
Now the meters go in, and they got new meters going in, so they're presumably going to take away that 3% that they were discounting.
Yes.
But the 3% that they were giving away before was factored into their rates when they did the rate study to justify their rate increase. So are they going to readjust their rates by the 3% on the 60% of the meters and lower everybody's rate down? How does that work?
It's a game as far as I'm concerned. They're in a position that even though they had significant rate increases that were passed and 4 years ago, they're coming back already and saying they need to increase it again. Now, this is in an environment where theoretically, if you look at the inflation rate is published all the time, and I have problems myself with that because I think that it's a bogus number. But as someone that's in that circumstance, what you should be asking is, if we're in a position that we've had 2% inflation for those 5 years, how in the world are you in a position you think you need to raise the rates by that much?
Okay, well, now, as I mentioned before we went to break, they're talking about raising them again. They actually had a rate consultant come in there, and so I'm watching the meetings, and I get the guy's name, and I decide, well, I'm going to call him up. Mm-hmm. And he was not made aware that 60% of the meters weren't working. And I go, how the heck can you do a rate study if the meters aren't working? He says, well, I didn't know that.
See, this is something I think that people don't realize about studies, and even the people that come in to do audits in public facilities, cities, things like that. If you look at the audit that takes place, for example, in Desert Hot Springs, and you look at the disclaimers that are put forth by the person that's doing the audit, you're in a position that there's a disclaimer that basically says, our view is based on the information that's been given to us by the organization. So unfortunately, theoretically, and actually it's happened in the past in a lot of cities that have had scandals, or special districts that have had scandals, which is what Mission Springs Water District is the person doing the research on the rate increase or doing the audit is blindsided later by the fact that they were given information that was either incomplete or inaccurate. That's part of what the elected officials are supposed to be watching and asking questions about, because there should be a check against that sort of information being put forth.
Well, the check is the public, and that's something that we were talking about that we were going to move into, and we can use that as a segue. So, all right, we're back with more Russ Betts and Joe McKee on iHub Radio.